students who prepare that because then we know that that's a student outcome that's working. Oh, well.
Sometimes.
It has been.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. So we started our time together with doing the quiz. We did 5 questions. Why do school systems exist? 0 to 10, what's the board's focus? 0 to 10, what's my focus? What are the board's adopted goals is where we left off. Woven through that conversation was this idea of what are the ways that I as a member of the body can begin to change my adult behaviors in ways that are more fully aligned with our collective focus on student outcomes. There's one item of the quiz that we have not gotten to yet, and that's what are the practices that can actually make a difference. As our entree into the 5th question, we actually want to now jump over to looking at what are the things that y'all talked about during the interviews. So we'll take this in 3 steps. We'll talk a little bit about the internal analysis. This is essentially just what y'all said. This is what we heard, a summary of it, but a summary in 2 different categories. What are areas of consensus? And generally, we didn't hear anybody say nah on this particular item. Essentially the ayes had it. And then what are some key decision points that y'all gonna have to make as a board? Decisions that you need to dig into and decide where we're gonna land on this. That was not clear to us that you had a clear sense of consensus, but it was something that nevertheless we would encourage you as a governing body to get clear about. Then another thing that a few of you asked about is, okay, so there's some places where we see other state boards that are doing something that's interesting that might be informative to us. And so in some of the areas where you all have some decision points, we tried to offer a few examples, to be completely transparent on this. One, a lot of these promising practices, I describe them as promising because they are fairly nascent. So we don't have a full set of evaluation of these worked out, but they are things that are relevant and related, where at least somebody else is doing something and it gives you some idea of, okay, maybe we want to do something, maybe we don't, at least there's some ideas to work from. So that's the external analysis. And then we'll close out our time together with next steps. Like based in, grounded in all this conversation we've had, what are we going to do about it? It's not enough to have a conversation about it. Either we're going to be about it or we've wasted a lot of time today. And so you'll have some decisions to make. We will not ask you to make any decisions today. That's not effective governance practice. Effective governance practice is I get some information, I have plenty of time to digest it, and then at a separate event, I make decisions on that. That's how hopefully y'all work. Hopefully y'all get your information well before the board meetings, and you have time to digest it, ask questions of your superintendent, and then make decisions at a separate point. So we won't be asking you to make any decisions today, but we will ask you to reflect on some potential next steps that might help you all make a difference. Ultimately, our job is never to tell you what should be your priorities or your focus or any of that. Our job is to argue that you should have a focus, and our job is to help you with designing the framework for it so that it actually will be workable for you, that you can actually use it. But what it is, that's a y'all thing, not an us thing. And so we'll dive into that a little bit more as regards to the implementation part of the program. So that being said, let's talk about some areas of consensus. Board should be focused on student achievement. I mentioned this earlier. This was pretty consistent across all the interviews, and that sounds like it should be a gimme. But just let me tell you from experience, that is not the case. I actually had a lady once argue aggressively that student outcomes was not part of their job. I was like, ma'am, I'm sorry, but that is inaccurate. And moreover, why are you here? And so that sounds like that should just be an obvious and gimme, but just know that from experience, that has not always been the case. But that was very much the case. When we asked people, what do you want, what do you want for the state? It was consistent across the board that folks, in various ways, notice it's a pretty generic statement. The board, there's a consensus the board should be focused on student achievement. That's about the end of the consensus. Like what aspects of that and what that looks like, there wasn't. With that, there was. With one exception, literacy is absolutely essential, in particular early literacy. Didn't hear anybody speak out against that as something that is a that should be an area of priority for the board. So while not everybody spoke on it, almost everybody who spoke on anything about student achievement, this was laced somewhere in there. Oh, we already talked about this other next point, board members interact professionally, and I tell you that's lovely, but that is insufficient. That the board needs to interact effectively as well. The board's work needs to not only be professional in demeanor, which what you already have, but needs to be effective in nature as well. What I didn't offer, but I want to be more specific now, you all already said this, but I'll just reiterate it so you understand that we believe the same thing that some of y'all have said. We know that a governing body is effective. In particular, I'll talk about state boards. We know that a state board is effective through how does it choose to invest its time. Is it looking, has it clarified, here are the priorities for what students should know and be able to do. Here are the priorities for how that can be done. And we are spending the preponderance of our time monitoring progress relative to those priorities. When that is the case, when the board is spending, you said at least half, that's almost literally what we have in our materials. The board is spending at least half of its time dialed into its priorities, monitoring progress relative to them. That's what the standard, what our standard of effectiveness for the board looks like. And so, to the extent that you are investing less than 50% of your time as you come together, monitoring progress toward the things that you expect, then you are not meeting our definition of effective. And that doesn't make you bad people. This isn't a morality play. It's not about good, bad, right, or wrong on this front. But it does mean that there's opportunity you're leaving on the table for children. And for a lot of your children, that's not going to happen. For a lot of your children, that's going to be okay. There are other safety nets in their life that'll work out. Maybe they've got a really strong community, that's, buoying children up, even, if the school didn't quite get them there. They, have a family, life, or they've got, big brothers and big sisters, like I had. I mean, maybe there's some other networks. But for your students for whom schools are the final safety net, every ounce of ineffectiveness that you bring to bear in your work directly impacts them. Those are the ones who are most vulnerable. And so it's important to be clear that when we talk about a board being effective, not just professional, that the repercussions of your ineffectiveness disproportionately land on your students who are furthest from educational justice. Students who most require educational justice, most require effectiveness from you. And every ounce of ineffectiveness that you allow to creep into this space disproportionately harms the children furthest from educational justice. It's hugely valuable that you all interact professionally. Again, that's a leg up y'all have that a lot of people don't. It's necessary, it's just insufficient. Any questions about our measure for effectiveness? That our measure for effectiveness is the board have clearly articulated priorities, and that it invests at least half of its time monitoring progress relative to those priorities. What questions do you have about our standard for effectiveness? Yeah?
Are you going to be able to provide some examples for the fourth bullet?
Clear set of agreed upon? Yes. Determine if it is being effective. Okay, so the fourth bullet is actually different. So does the board have priorities? That is separate from, is the board spending its time focused on those priorities? So what the fourth bullet is have we come up with ways of measuring, are we focused on our priorities? Now the first step of that is the board would need to be crystal clear about what its priorities are. I am clear that y'all are not clear. So that's step one, is a board, like how are we crystal clear about what are the priorities? Then, how do we begin to redesign how we use our time in order to make those priorities the centerpiece of our time together? Once you do that, then we start talking about, that's something we can measure. And what we do is we literally measure your minutes. How many minutes did you spend? And if you spent 9 hours, our question is always going to be the exact same. Is you spend at least 4.5 of those hours really monitoring progress towards your priorities. And then the other 4.5 hours on whatever else you have to get done. Because remember, you got a lot of statutory requirements, and those things aren't going away. We know that, y'all know that. What we're saying is make the main thing the main thing.
But isn't there more than just the time allocation?
There are a lot more. There are just not a lot more that we have really solid evidence around. So for example, the evidence in the literature around how much time do board members spend visiting schools? Like, I can't show you any evidence around that. And so I'd like to measure that. I tend to think that there's some value to that, and you're actually seeing what's happening on the ground and so on and so forth. I just don't have evidence that I can point to in the research literature around that. And so that's part of the problem I was saying earlier, is there's just not a lot of folks who are saying, hey, let's dig into state boards of ed and see what they're doing and what in their behaviors makes a difference. That body of research exists in plenitude when it comes to teachers and principals and even superintendents, and even to, local school boards. And so a lot of the evidence that we rely on really is looking at local school boards and nonprofit education entities. But there's just not a ton of evidence that we can point to. So yes, we've got a few different metrics that all kind of interweave with the board's use of time, but they're all orbit around that issue because that's just where the strongest evidence is. Yeah, I've got a lot of other things that I think, other things that I can evidence that. Other questions about our insistence on the board increasing its effectiveness and how we, particularly the predominant way that we measure that, which is how is the board using its time. Other questions about that? Some of the other tools that we have, we already mentioned earlier, we have tools around the quality of questions that folks ask. Are they really dialed in, or are they just kind of shotgun? We've got a tool around evaluating the agendas. We can actually run you through an agenda evaluation. And in addition to the time use evaluation, we have a board self-evaluation instrument that looks at a number of other behaviors of the board that we think are meaningful. But again, the only thing that we have really kind of compelling amount of evidence around that seems to have been investigated, at least, is around the board's use of time. And that leads us then into the fourth bullet, is working with y'all to identify what is it that you all want to get to. So for example, our coaching is that if you want to maximize your effectiveness, you'll get clear about what are the outcomes we want for students, what we want our students to know and be able to do, and how are we measuring progress for that. And we spend half of our time together as a body doing that. That's what we say. If we think we can back that up, you can do the reading yourself and decide what you arrive at. But I've had boards that say, well, we don't want to spend half of our time on what our students are learning. We only want to spend a third of our time. Okay, well, great. We will always tell you that it's suboptimal, but if that's what you choose, then we'll absolutely support you. We'd much rather have you be at 33% than 15%. And by the way, you're not at 15%. But if you could get to 33%, we would see that as a victory for children. So that's what we do about the fourth bullet, is we will definitely inform you of what we think we have evidence to back up are the practices that will most help you serve students. But ultimately, you all have to collectively decide, like, how do we want to govern as a body? And we'll push you as far as you will let us push you, and then wherever you stop, then that's where we will work with you to at least get there, because at least that will be better than where you are today. Other questions about that fourth bullet now that we're off? So these were areas of consensus that you don't currently have a clear measure of are we being effective or not. That's just what came up in the conversation. Like, we get along, and we do a lot of stuff. Like, we're conscientious about the work. But the repeated refrain in the interviews, but I don't know that means that we're actually getting the things done that we're able to check off the activities that we're supposed to check off, but how do we know if they're the right activities? How do we know if we're actually having an impact? That's the question that kept coming up from folks. And you all wanted some clear metrics around how could we know if we're doing our part. Other areas of consensus. The board as a whole does not have an aligned vision for statewide improvement. This was interesting. As I heard very different perspectives around what are the key activities that the key policies that make the most sense. It sounds like over the past year or so, y'all have had quite a few discussions about some of these things, some that have just never landed, so never actually turned into anything. So you talk about stuff, but you never did anything at the end of that. And I think that left people feeling a sense of frustration. But then also that there, at times, it seemed to be, way far apart, and that there hadn't been the work necessary to try to get to what would an aligned vision look like. What is it that we believe, not just what we need to accomplish, but the high level of what are the critical hows that we should be focused on. That it just, the sense that we got was that it's not aligned, that you all are on the same page. That shouldn't be particularly surprising, given the goal recitation activity we just did. Like, if there's not clarity on where we're going, it shouldn't be surprising if there's not clarity on how do we get there. But it's worth noting that the latter, you actively expressed some some concern around, saying, hey, I don't have a sense that we're aligned in this area. And there's an expression that alignment would be valuable. There seemed to be consensus around that as well. The one area that did come up repeatedly, and I suspect that's because this is a national phenomenon that a lot of folks are dealing with, shortages of teachers, that there will continue to be a challenge around recruitment and retention of effective teachers, and trying to figure out, is there a consensus that this should be an ongoing top priority of the board, and if so, what would that look like? So no clear answers there, but just consensus that this is a challenge. So those are the areas of consensus. Any questions about any of these areas of consensus that y'all had as a result of these interviews? And like I said, we won't say who said what. There was a lot more that you said, but we're just reporting back on, here's what was said where there seemed to be a consensus across the body. Questions about any of the items in the area of consensus before I go on to some of the decision-making options you have? All right, so here's some areas where there was not consensus, and the nature of the non-consensus is such that we feel like you should probably come together and reach a consensus or make a decision. Step one, and it seemed odd that there was such a broad sense of thinking on this, but that's why we dropped it here. What should be the relationship between the board and the superintendent? Inside of this lived questions around what should the communication between the board and the superintendent be? What does that accountability look like? This is just an area where it came up over and over again, and it was kind of odd. And you all are in a special position, as I understand it. You all appoint the superintendent, right? And so this is one of those areas where it's really hard to be helpful to you, because I don't know if you all have looked, but I don't think there is two states in the union that do this thing the exact same. There's the board itself is appointed by the governor or elected or a mixture of the two. The superintendent of education is appointed by the governor, appointed by the state board, elected independently, or some confluence of the three. The number of board, so it is a real hotspot. So it's hard to have, I can't point you to, here's another state that looks like y'all and they're doing pretty well. This is something that y'all really going to have to sit down and hammer out. We would encourage you want to hammer this out. And probably the reason that this lives at the very first item on the list is because that last goal-setting activity bore out something that we do see pretty frequently and that we recommend that you reconcile. Is that our position is that the governing body should set the priorities for the organization. And then the organization should come up with a plan to be responsive to how are we going to accomplish these priorities. That is our position. And you need to be clear, not everybody has that same position, so if this sounds foreign, that's not uncommon. Our position is that the governing body should set the priorities for the organization. And then the job of the superintendent, commissioner of education, whatever you call it across the country, is then to come up with a plan for how do we implement that. And unless I'm missing something, it looks like the board, in fact, did not set the priorities. In the absence of the board setting the priorities, the superintendent did the only reasonable thing, which is to fill in the leadership gap that was created and set the priorities themselves. And it sounds like trying to pull you into that, but we would strongly encourage you to come up with a plan to reverse the polarity of that process, where it should be the board that is saying, here are the vision and values of our state, and we're going to condense that down, the vision and values of our state, we're going to condense that down to a set of priorities, and those will be the priorities. And all of our work as a board will be aligned with these priorities, and all the work of the staff will be aligned with these priorities. Superintendent, your job is to take these priorities that represent the vision and values of the entire state that we were selected and elected to represent. Your job as superintendent is to take those priorities and then come up with a plan for all that is involved in implementing the priorities. That doesn't appear to be the relationship that exists here. That is a relationship we would encourage. Yes?
To your point, I'm looking at the mission, vision, philosophy, and goals of BESE on our website. And while similar, they're different from that vision, mission, goals, in this case, educational priorities. I'm not sure how we got there, but.
We notice the same.
Yeah.
And what we're saying is that, that is not going to work out. That is not going to let you optimize focus. And that really needs to be alignment there. And so you've heard our perspective on how you arrive at that alignment. You're not even remotely the first organization to find yourself in this situation. And what we're suggesting is that be a top priority, and that be a valuable gift that you hand to the next board, that you kind of square that circle before they come along. Other questions on this first bullet? This is the heavy one. So if there's anything on all this you want to talk about, we're going to come back to this in the next steps. But if there's anyone that you wanted to dive into, this is a good candidate. Any other questions about that first one? What should the relationship between the board and the superintendent? What should be the relationship between the board and the superintendent? Any other questions or reflection on that? Or if we've shared something, if I've said something that says, no, AJ, that doesn't sound quite right, then please correct me, because I don't want to be saying something that's inaccurate. But based on our homework of scouring your website, as well as visiting with y'all, this is our current understanding. So if our understanding is incorrect, please correct us. Or any questions about that one? And of course, the superintendent, we're not just talking about you, you're here, you're welcome to say something on it too. All right, I will take that as agreement that we ain't crazy and that we capture the situation accurately. All right, it is what it is. All that leaves is, continuous improvement is just that, it's continuous. It's not about where we are, it's about where we're going. So if it's something you want to work on, we're excited to work on with you. The next one is, how should the board evaluate its own effectiveness? This is a decision point. There was agreement that it would be useful for the board to have some idea about what effectiveness looks like, but that leaves you with this key decision, is how will we evaluate our effectiveness? We've got obviously we have a lot of recommendations and tools that we've developed over time, but that is a decision that y'all and y'all alone can make. We cannot tell you how to evaluate yourselves. We can give you a bunch of recommendations, but ultimately you all need to be bought into, you know what, this is how we're going to evaluate ourselves. And when these measures look this way, that means we are failing children by our own admission. And when these measures look this way, this means we're serving children by our own admission. Like, we want you to have that degree of clarity. Right now, y'all don't have that degree of clarity. And I think not having clarity in that area always makes it a little bit harder to improve. If we say to a teacher, hey, you should go get better. All right, so what does get better look like? I don't know, but go do it. Like, that's not fair. And that doesn't help continuous improvement. So again, you all saying, here's how we're going to evaluate ourselves and whether or not we're effective. Like I said, we'll offer you a bunch of tools, but which ones you pick and how you deploy them, that's a decision you have to make, because you have to own it. It can't be because we said it, has to be because you said it. Any questions about this decision point that the board needs to come up with a plan for evaluating its own effectiveness? Let me ask something different. When's the last time this board conducted a self-evaluation? That's the same answer I get with pretty much every state board I've ever worked with. And this is just a norm, is that we've never thought through, hey, we want everybody else to continuously improve, but we don't hold ourselves accountable to that same standard. I don't know about your parenting technique, but when I tried to get away with do as I say, not as I do, that did not work out for me. I suspect it's not going to work out for you either. And so if you want there to be this culture of continuous improvement throughout the agency and throughout your schools and every classroom, our coaching is that starts with leading by example right here, saying we're going to put a flag in the sand, we're going to say this is what effectiveness looks like for us as a governing team. But what's the number one reason people don't bother to self-evaluate? Guesses?
Why they don't?
Pretty
They
great.
don't want to change.
Yeah, I don't actually want to do anything differently. I would like to perpetuate the myth of my own greatness. And I would like that to be unencumbered by the problematic nature of data that suggests otherwise. And so know that it accrues to your benefit not to self-evaluate, but it does not accrue to the benefit of your students.
Doesn't this go back to the fourth bullet on the previous page?
Yes, that's correct. So there was a consensus that y'all should do something about this. We're just saying, there's a decision point, y'all need to decide what you're going to do. That's absolutely correct. And you'll see there's some parallelism between these decision points and some of them, not all of them. How should the board use its limited time together each year? This is directly related to that. Right now, it sounds like you use time in particular, and I love the example of committees. Committees is a significant use of time. Don't discount that. I'd be thinking through, okay, how are those committees used? And in fact, when we encourage boards to evaluate their use of time in a given quarter, we include the time spent in committees. So imagine the 9 hours we spent as a body, then however many hours we spent across 4 committees. Let's just pretend it was an hour each. Okay, great, we've got 13. Did somebody snicker? Then great, if it's 13 hours, then the question isn't, did you spend 4.5 hours monitoring progress towards your priorities? The question at that point is, did we spend 6.5 hours monitoring, when you add in the extra time for your committees? So having those committees be really aligned to your priorities becomes important if you're going to talk about how should we use our limited time each year. Other questions about board self-evaluation or board time use? Other questions or reflections on that before we move on?
Do you have tools for the self-evaluation?
Every single thing we're talking about, we definitely have a spreadsheet. You just plug things in and it cranks out a percentage. And then you can just see over time, either we got stronger or we stayed the same, or we actually got weaker in our focus. Yes, every single tool that we have, there's a spreadsheet. You plug in some data points that are observation, mostly observation of the board, but I say observation of the board, not opinions about the board. Most of our tools are not based on, do I like what the board members said about it? That is not relevant. What's relevant is how did the board choose to spend its time? Did it spend its time focused on student outcomes, or did it not? This is a binary phenomenon, as opposed to, do the board members care about student outcomes? Well, I don't know. I'm not in your hearts. I can't measure that. Did I hear things that for me sounded like that? Maybe, and other people did. So if you hear evaluations of board effectiveness that sound really mushy, we guide you away from that. You should be looking at what are things that we can tangibly measure, that she looks at and she sees the same thing, I look at it, I see the same thing, that one of our other coaches look at, we all see the exact same thing. It's a relatively objective measure of board performance. That's what we would want you benchmarking yourselves against. Whether you like each other, whether people are friends, whether people are nice to each other, all those type of things. We don't have rubrics for those things, only because we want you to be able to look at concrete changes in behavior that you can make that are less subject to the interpretation or cultural variation. Other questions about time use or board evaluation effectiveness? This fourth bullet is one that we've already talked about quite a bit as well. What can the current board do to set up the future board for success? And we've already mentioned that very first bullet we put at the top of that list is do not allow future boards to come into, I think the word of the day is muddy, do not allow future boards to come into the same money circumstances that you likely inherited. These are likely the circumstances that you inherited. We get that. So the question is, how can we not pass on this particular inheritance? I want to pause for a moment, and I just want to hear from folks. And I may do some cold calling here because I want to get some feedback on this one. What are things that you all see that you could do above and beyond dealing with these first three boards? What are things that you all see that this body could do to really set up the next board for success? So the majority of this body will roll off, a whole bunch of new folks will roll on. What are things that you see that could happen in the next 6 months that could most set that group up for success? What comes to mind?
Just at a high level, I think it's worth a conversation to review the current onboarding or orientation process for new board members.
Good call. Onboarding and orientation, that'd be high on our list as well.
And I think maybe even thinking about us as, for some of us it'll be more recent than others, but thinking about what were the most difficult things that you had, like from a learning perspective as a new member, like what are the hardest things to grasp? And then figuring out, when I was at Michigan State, it was the first time term limits were being enacted, so we had 1 year where over half of the legislature was going to be new. And so our Public Policy Institute did a boot camp for the 5 biggest problems facing the state of Michigan. It's a very nonpartisan, but just like, here's the data, here's what you're gonna have to grapple with. And so thinking about something along those lines that we might be able to do to kind of prepare the next board to maybe, I guess, make their learning curve less steep than it was.
Yeah, what are the things that were hardest for us to wrestle with as a team, and how do we front load some training that'll really help folks be able to, their learning curve, they can move more quickly along and so they can get into productivity soon. Yeah, other things. Yeah, here, and then we'll come down to the end.
I think this board should actually put in place how we're going to evaluate, just what you were saying, since we've not done that. So that the end board will have the tools to, after they've set up in time, do an assessment. Just like we do an assessment of the superintendent, but I think the board should have the tools and the metrics, whatever it's going to use to evaluate.
Yeah. All right, so getting some tools in place for evaluation, and we look at it 2 ways: board self-evaluation, and then does the board evaluate the superintendent?
Yes.
And then we said that you want to make sure that both the board self-evaluation is aligned to the priorities and the superintendent evaluation is aligned to the priorities. Yeah, what could this board do to set up the next board for success?
During our lunch break, I was eavesdropping on a conversation between Mr. Rock and Mr. Garvey. And Mr. Rock said, Jim, you've been on this board for 12 years. And Mr. Garvey said, actually, I've been on this board for 16 years, a fact that I didn't know, which is quite remarkable. And as I think about the brain trust that we're going to lose in 6 or 7 months is quite significant. We lose Dr. Kofi, we lose Mr. Garvey, we lose Ms. Gaucher, perhaps Dr. Davis, perhaps Mr. Rock, perhaps. Just thinking about those folks that people have said we're likely going to lose. And that's a powerful group of folks right there. When you think about their collective experience, wisdom, knowledge, and if we continue down this path, we'll find ourselves in January going, oops, they're gone, let's start over at the board. That there should be a way by which we mine as much information from these folks in terms of how can, based on what they've seen and learned, both as a member of the board, but in their own respective professions, how they might advise the next board.
Yeah.
Here's what I've seen and learned from the mouth and mind of Jim Garvey over 16 years. So or is negotiating, how are we going to? I think that if I had to hand someone a manual picking up on Mr. Morris's comment about orientation, or reflect upon our orientation when we became new board members, and it was good. I didn't have this. Yeah, someone said, we give you what they learn in some condensed or not so condensed fashion, where we build upon that as we begin, as opposed to taking 4 years to learn it for ourselves.
Right.
And either, take Mr. Morris and I, maybe we'll be back, but it would be tragic that we've gotten 4 years in, and I'll speak for myself, feel like I can kind of get the hang of this, and then I move on.
Yeah.
How do you accelerate that process? Sandy, I didn't throw you in that group because we hope that you're coming back, but the same thing would be true for her as well, in terms of wealth of experience that we'd be woefully remiss if we didn't take advantage of what's available to us now.
Yeah. This is a really important idea. Like, how can we take advantage of the wisdom that is currently here? And in a moment, I'll offer you some additional ideas on that. But anybody else thoughts? What can the current board do to set up the future board for success?
So I want to go back to what we talked about before we left, getting alignment on those priorities. And I think all of the words described it are words that we wouldn't want, right? Like, we want it to be shared, we want to be aligned, we want it to be clear. And so I think the gift we can give the BESE of 2024 is that, and that alignment. Now, maybe they would reject it, but at the very least, we could package it in a way to where they can make a decision,
Yep.
right? And then they don't walk into the unshared or muddy
If they
priorities.
if they don't have an option to choose from, that's your failure. If they have options and they choose poorly, that's on them. Setting them up for success means what options can we place in front of them. And what they do with it, that's no longer on me. But we set them up with options, that they could be successful. Like you said it earlier, like, let's put some priorities up. And it would be better for them to look at 3 priorities and say, well, we don't like this one, we want this one instead. Okay, now we have 3 priorities. Then at least they start with 3 priorities, as opposed to not having anything on the wall. And then they come in and it's like, all right, so what are we doing next? We got 13 hours of time to spend in this quarter. What are we going to do? So yeah, having it prepared for them, I agree, is better than not having it prepared for them. Even if they reject it, at least that might inform their thinking about what direction to go in. They're going to allow them to speed up their movement toward effectiveness.
I understand about the priorities, but I think back as a veteran educator and knowing a lot about education, I still had issues, or let me use a better word, concerns,
Yeah.
on being on this board, of not being able to see the big picture.
Yeah.
Like, these are your priorities, these are our priorities, but how do we get there? And I'm thinking about the input, the output, and the outcome. And is it something that we can do for new board members coming in to see what are the things we're working on? Where are we with output? And what is the outcome that we want to be able to see the big picture, the broad, or whatever we may want to call it? And I still have that concern with being able to see the big picture. And hopefully this week, I understand we may have the big picture presented to us to understand it, but not once a year.
Yeah.
It's like you have it once a year, not, oh, yeah, now remember, to be visible before us continually.
Yeah, it's not enough to talk about it once a year. What our coaching is that you not merely talk about it constantly, but literally by the end of the year, we should be able to say, half of our time this year was spent really dialed into monitoring progress relative to these priorities. Not, well, once this year we talked about priorities, the rest of the time we've been counting how many cars were out in the parking lot of the basketball game, rather than really monitoring, are we scoring? Anyone else? What can the current board do to set the future board up for success? Any other reflections on this?
I got one.
Yeah.
I'm going to pretend that I'm state superintendent.
Oh, yes.
Preston K. Brumley. And what I would say, if I were he speaking, is I would raise up this sheet of paper, and I would say, in the most respectful way possible, you all should adopt what we've adopted as a department and save yourself a lot of time, and we would all be aligned. Now, Superintendent Brumley would never say that, but you might be thinking it.
Yeah, so this is something you'll have to wrestle with. And by the way, what you just described is not unprecedented. That we've worked with other boards, mostly local school boards have done this, where the superintendent had adopted a set of priorities, and then the board went back and looked and said, you know what? Even if we had run our own process, we probably would have come up with the same thing. And so we're going to take the formal action of adopting these. These are no longer the superintendent's priorities. These are now our priorities. And these have the full force of board policy rather than this is just something that staff is doing. And then clarifying that everything should be aligned back to that. The alignment of the resources, human and financial, you need to show us the alignment of they stop being optional. And so that is a path that has been taken before, or it may be that you all choose to go through a process to double check the superintendent's back. Are these really the top priorities as we understand it, as the representatives of the vision and values of this state? It is not, the superintendent's job is not to be the state's representative. He wasn't elected to represent, he wasn't appointed to be the representative, he was appointed to be the implementer in chief. And so maybe you all go out and do your homework and say, no, actually it's these things over here. Having read them, I kind of doubt there would be that much, but it's possible. I mean, I've not seen it before, but it's possible. I think another likely scenario, probably the second one, I think the most likely scenario is like, yeah, this is already pretty much what we would have adopted. We're going to go ahead and adopt something this or something very similar. I think the second most likely scenario is like half of this is exactly spot on and half of this is not. We're going to create this new one, and then superintendent, you need to make modifications to be in alignment with the direction we're going. I can't think of a time where I've seen the superintendent did this work and then the board did it and came up with something completely diametrically opposed. But if that was the case, then our coaching would be the same. Well, if that's what the board came up with, the superintendent needs to abandon this entirely and be in alignment with the board. But that is the nature of the relationship that we suggest, that the board needs to be clear about who are the priorities for our state, but from us, the representatives, and the superintendent's job is to implement those priorities. But I think it's very possible, having visited with you all, that you may look at that sheet and say, actually, we think the staff kind of nailed this one, but then we would still coach you to take the formal action of saying, these are ours, and they're not, and we're putting a stake in the ground. The other thing that we would do is we would encourage you to move some of this toward being SMART, to being specific, measurable, attainable results focused, time bound. And so right now, the priorities I've described don't meet that standard. If the board, which is appropriate for what they were adopted for the administration, but if the board's going to adopt them, then we'd recommend the board adopt a SMART version that says, here's the exact percentage of what is true now, and here's what we expect to be true by this date, certain in the future. That's if the board chose to adopt the document almost exactly as it is. There's just a few tweaks like that we'd recommend. But otherwise, you have pretty clear selling because the document already has pretty much all the stuff that we would normally recommend be in the document, which again is unusual. Normally, you're not so blessed to have staff that are competent enough to have the right information in the document. But you all are that fortunate, so bravo. Other thoughts about how the current board could set the future board up for success before you transition? Yeah.
I would say too, just the transition onto the board, never speaking to your predecessor or someone who has been, I mean, like, it just feels like such like a static, like it's a start
Yeah.
and a stop, and then there is, you know, very little real communication, unless you already have a relationship with that person in some way. And since I represent 19 parishes, I mean, unless I know that person, then we may or may
You
not.
may be on opposite sides of the state.
Right. So I think that, you know, as you transition off, even like a mentoring process of sorts, or even just a common courtesy of, here's what's been going on, here's what I know, here's the people I think you should meet. I mean, I think as those who are transitioning off make that transition, it's just kind of part of the process, I think, to set the next board up. Whether they take that or not, you did your work.
Yep, that's right, that's right.
And I was even hoping along those lines that we might even think about at our end of the year party, like inviting the people that have been elected to the board, the newcomers, right, to come to our end of the year. It might be a great way for us to meet them, and then you can start the beginning of that process of, you know, talking, and that, you know, there could be some collaboration across firms. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's led by, you know, your president too. I mean, that board president, that kind of seems to like set the tone and culture of how the board moves forward. So I feel like maybe that piece is something that we, I don't know, maybe it's never even been discussed,
Yeah.
but certainly should be addressed going forward, is how do we transition?
Yeah. Any other thoughts before I transition? So I want to add two things. One that is a bridge on what you just said, so I'm glad that you all mentioned it before I did. And then another one. So first, onto this point, yes, I was actually absolutely going to recommend a formal structure around mentoring. And then I would recommend there be a formal expectation of what that mentoring looks like before the new folks transition out, but then also a formal expectation of what that mentoring looks like after the new folks have transitioned in. So what do I mean by that? Is there should be some type of like document that says, okay, you were transitioning out, you need to find time to meet with the person who's transitioning into the same seat that you're transitioning out of. You need to take them to dinner, and here's a list of things you need to talk about with them while you're at dinner. Like that formalized structure. The problem is if it's not that structured, people just don't do it. Like folks, like my term is up, deuces, you know, people just disappear. Like you can't find nobody, people ain't answering their phone, they treat you like a bad ex-girlfriend or something. Like they're gone and you can't get them back. If you don't have a really clear structure in place, then people just kind of ghost. And I'm guilty of that too. I told people, hey, when my term's up, y'all gonna have to work to find this brother. And I made myself available, but I didn't reach out to them because I didn't want to be an encumbrance. And so that was my thing. It's like I didn't not call them because I didn't want to help. I didn't call them because I didn't want to feel like I was overstepping, overreaching. Simultaneously, you have new folks coming in and thinking, well, I don't want to bother those folks, or I don't know, maybe they don't want to talk to me, maybe they're sad that their time is up and I'm over. Like, and so on both sides, there are all these reasons that people don't just pick up the phone and connect. That's why I'm saying if it is not formalized, it's just not going to happen. And so what we recommend is you put in a formal system of mentoring that describes what exact behaviors you expect out of current board members before you phase off. And then, what do we expect of you after you phase off? And it would be on the board, and we would say it is an excellent use of your resource and your budget to whatever kind of thing you need to do to incentivize that. You need to cover, you know, their expenses, travel, that type of stuff, obviously. Like, think of it as think of it as part of your professional development budget. Is that, you know, board member Craven's not gonna be around after this, you know, but we're gonna make sure that we cover his expenses so that he can make intentional time to sit down with the new board member Jackson who's come in. Because if you don't cover my expenses, as the former board member, I'm less likely to do it, like out of my own pocket. I've already volunteered enough, like I'm just less inclined to do that. So you want to have appropriate incentives in place to make it easy for people to say yes. To checking in with folks for, again, a very defined period of time after the transition has occurred. So we wouldn't just say, yeah, you should mentor people coming in. We recommend putting in place a very structured mentoring process that starts before the transition and extends after the transition. Any questions about that? Or anybody have particular thoughts like, that sounds horrible?
I don't. I have a question as to whether or not you have the list, because going back to Preston, for me, it's gonna be 12 years on the board, and it's like, where do I even begin? You know, I mean, my sense of connecting with a future member is, it's already overwhelming. I don't wanna contribute to it being overwhelming, so it is, where do you begin to help people, you know, dip their toe into the water, but not scare them away from actually signing the document in January. So that's that would be the hard part. I want to share, I want to help, but I don't want to overwhelm somebody in a situation that is already overwhelming.
And that's why I recommend there be a literal document that says, here's exactly what you're going to talk about. So, because otherwise it will just be kind of awkward. And so having it be that explicit where there's literally, you're handed, here's my mentoring script for our first meeting. Here's my mentoring script for the next one. Like we would help you build that out. So that way, if it does seem a little bit awkward, at least you have, here is what would be useful for us to discuss. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I was just gonna, you could just throw somebody in and when they're on vacation after the election, get a call from Ms. Davis saying, you have to be here next week for your first meeting.
We have an onboarding guide, which board members can use for their own one-pager.
Yeah. But we recommend growing the onboarding guide to include some templates of this, and this. So that's one thing, yeah.
I mean, I do, you know, in theory, the mentoring piece is what I would really enjoy. I'm just not sure from an elected perspective how realistic it is. Like assuming the person who was before me was not even hoping I would win, it's gonna be an awkward conversation. So I think that's the challenge for us, is that maybe there is someone in the range of opportunities, maybe not your predecessor, maybe not someone who's actually sat in your seat, but someone who has some, you know, level of knowledge and mentoring capabilities.
Not even the most awkward recommendation we're gonna make. We have the even more awkward one coming up here.
Okay, all right.
And so, do we recognize that's awkward? Yes. And have more awkwardness coming in about 30 seconds.
Okay, can't wait.
Yeah.
I don't want to stop in 30 seconds. But there's some value in, and I've done this with folks where I get an oral history. And this may not be the best way to do it, but maybe. And that is that there are certain things that you would probably, the next person wants to know. But instead of counting on them to mentor and give their time afterwards in advance, it's sort of, here's some key things that I would like to share. Will you get one of us to write down lots of information? Maybe some of it, but it was great to sit down and interview Doris Boucher and say, look, I got some questions for you. And I know I speak for many of us on the board. When Doris starts talking about certain things, I just go, man, how does she know all of that? But when she leaves, there will be that guy. I'm sure there'll be someone else that come along. But that will be missing. And how do you capture that in some way? And you can say, Doris, can you write us an essay? But you also could say, hey, Doris, can I come interview you for an hour or two on some key topics that the next person might want to know about? And that would be extraordinarily valuable. People do oral history for that same reason. But it'll be great 6 months from now. But imagine 5 years from now. Imagine 10 years from now.
Catch me in the nursing.
Something to consider.
And I'm gonna go visit you.
The other thing that we put out there as a recommendation, which people tend to find even more awkward than the last recommendation. State board school. What we would recommend is that with regularity in advance of a new election cycle and appointment cycle on the board, that the current board host a state board school, a workshop, usually a full Saturday-long workshop, where folks who might even have some interest in understanding of what it's like to advocate for the state board, whether these are statewide parent leaders or statewide teacher leaders, statewide community leaders, other elected officials, or folks who find themselves potentially interested in one day running for or being selected for the state board, that they can come out and you have a full day-long curriculum where you're training them on what does it look like to be an effective state board member. In this context, it is doing exactly what you just described, only worse. That's awkward because this is a person who just got elected to a seat that maybe I want to stay in. This is more awkward. Is I'm actively going to train the person who might in the future be running against me so I can help them be more effective in case they win. That is what we recommend, is that you host a state board school. We say, look, here's a training. We offer it every year. We aren't waiting for the election to come along. Every year we've got a Saturday that we set aside and we invite folks to come. To this, probably not to this room, but a room that's a little more conducive to dialogue, and folks can learn about what does it look like to be an effective state board member, or what does it look like to effectively interact with and advocate with the state board, and that you do some type of state board school just every year as a matter of course, with the intention that everyone who eventually serves on the state board has had an opportunity to attend state board school. They've had an opportunity to learn more about what the job is from the people currently inhabiting it before they even think about putting their name forward to serve on the board. And again, the number one pushback we give for board members is like, so wait a minute, you really want us to train the people who want to replace us? Yes. Because what you need to be clear about, if it's not already clear, this ain't about you. Like, if somebody's going to come here and they are going to replace you forcibly against your desire, it is still in your best interest that they be really good at it when they get here. And more importantly, it's in the best interest of the students you serve, they be really, really good at it when they get here. And so, yes, we absolutely recommend that you actively invest in training the people who seek to replace you and mentoring the people who have replaced you. We would add that to the list of things that you've already described regarding what the current board can do to set the future board up for success. And so in this context, if the election is in November, then we recommend, probably somewhere in the September timeframe at the latest, that you consider hosting some type of state board school where folks will come in and learn. Here's what the state board does. Here's what we don't do. You've probably had this where other people think you do stuff that is not your job. This is a great opportunity to give people that information as well. Wait a minute. So even if I get on the state board, I can't fire my kid's coach who's no good. Well, then why would I run for the state board then? People should know that before they run. And so those are the two additional items that we would recommend on top of the thing you said. Which, as I said, I assure you is even more awkward than you might have surmised. But this is how effective organizations perpetuate effectiveness over time. Is you make investments that are awkward for you, but that are great for kids. Other reflections on setting the future board up for success before we transition?
I just have to know if anyone's taken you up on a state board school.
On the state board school, so we did essentially a miniature version of this in Texas, where we provided training for folks who were interested, and I had a lot of fun. But where the state board members have stepped forward and said, not only should it happen, but we will come and be the faculty for it. No, I would recommend it to you. I've had a number of local boards of ed that have, however, where they've said, I will actively participate in training the group of people who are running against me so that should they win, that they are better positioned to set our children up for greatness. Absolutely. We've had probably a dozen or so boards take that route.
Well, the question I have are, the great idea, were you a member that was paid?
No, I was not paid.
You were not paid, and local boards or state boards that are paid, where we're not paid to do this, that are willing to give up their time to develop school, train, etc.
Yeah, so definitely when I served, I was a local school board member, not a state board member. As a local school board member, yeah, I was not paid a dime. I was just like y'all. I was giving my time to try to make things better for the students that I served. And yes, my board, we absolutely ran a school board school and brought in all the folks who were absolutely eager to run against us and did everything in our power to help them be as effective on day one as they could be, because that is what selfless service demands, is that it not be about me, it be about the organization being more effective, whether I'm part of it or not. And this is one of those things, having put together the curriculum for this before, both at the state level and the local level, be happy to support you if this is something you want to do. So those are topics about setting up the future board for success. On to next. There was some concern around is there a shared definition of what college career readiness is? So let me just check in. Do you all have a shared definition of what it means for a student to be college career ready?
It's on our agenda for next week, or
Wednesday.
for Wednesday.
All right, so ideally it's coming. So you would discuss it on Wednesday or adopt it?
Hopefully adopted.
Okay, well, it may be that you knock out, this is one of these decision points. That would be phenomenal. We think it's pretty hard, because that leads to the second bullet point. Does the board's policy framework have the right incentives in place? We would say it is really, really hard for your policy framework to be well calibrated with students being college career readiness if you haven't adequately defined what is college career ready. And so this came up from a couple of folks, and we heavily agreed with you. This is a clear decision that y'all need to make, and then you need to check to make sure that your policies are aligned with it. Probably one of the most spicy areas of this that came up when I was at the state agency next door is to say that a student is career ready, which industry certificates actually confer that and which ones do not. And what we did is we partnered up with the Texas Workforce Commission and the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board to get a sense of what were some of the high demand areas, as well as what were family supporting jobs that with the certificate you could earn a family supporting wage. And as a result of that, we cut off a number of ones that people felt like, hey, this IBC should count. And we said actually it doesn't meet our minimum threshold of our definition of what it means to be college and career ready. And so just know that kicked up quite a bit of dust. If you all have a full-throated conversation about how you define college ready, that's one thing. Entirely separate from that is how you define career ready. And ideally you were using some type of external sources to validate what career readiness means, not just relying on your own judgment. That's the first two bullets. It sounds like you already have that on there. The next two bullets came up several times around what is the role of growth in your accountability system, and should the board revisit accountability at all. So there was no clarity on either of these points. Things kind of bounced around and were all over the place. And so we would recommend that you in fact answer the question of, is it something we should revisit? And if so, then revisit it. But if you decide that, no, we don't need to revisit this, then great, don't. But we think you should at least answer the question of, do we think this needs to be revisited or not? If the answer is no, so be it. If the answer is yes, then calendarize it. But those two questions, should the board revisit accountability, and should the board revisit growth and accountability? Folks who are kind of all over the place, and we think this is probably a pretty important thing, so we weren't comfortable over just stepping over. So I really want to move on because I don't want to get into a deep discussion about accountability today. But we do recommend that you all, at some point, have that conversation. And then finally, should the board have additional behavior norms for board meetings? Like I said, you all work together pretty well, but there are a number of areas of just how you operate that seem to be a little bit murky. Some of them were about communication, what information gets communicated, on what timeline does it get communicated, what if we have questions, and what is the process for that? So some of it just felt like there's an opportunity to smooth some of that out by having some clear norms for board meetings that describe what can we expect among each other, what can we expect among staff, and what is the timeline of those expectations. That we felt like interviewing you all and doing a deeper dive into that to figure out what's working and not working, and then we can come back and recommend a set of procedures to bolster what you currently have that just makes it a little bit more clear. How do we work together in advance of, during, and after board meetings? So that was the last item. This is just a hodgepodge of concerns that we think you could probably sort out with a few well-written procedures. So those were the decision points. Questions about any of the decision points before we talk about a few promising ideas, since you all did indicate you wanted to have some sense of interesting things that are happening around you related to some of these things. Any other questions about these decision points? And so essentially, as you see in the next steps, we basically recommend taking all these decision points and building out a calendar and just building out a work plan for all of it. So we say, okay, we want to get all these things done. We just need to build out a timeline and then start iterating through that timeline to get the things done. And so all of this will come back, would come back to you in the form of an implementation timeline that says, okay, here are the things that are important. Here's the scope and sequence we'll use to get them done. And we, if you all want us to, we work with you to do that. So moving on to some fun stuff. Promising practices that we've seen. Items number, the first two bullets, items in the strategic plan are clearly tied to the organization's allocation of staff. So ideally, if we say this is a top priority, that as additional resources become available, we would expect that they be applied to that. And normally when additional resources are being applied, it's either going out the door in the form of grants or it's staying in-house in the form of staffing allocation. So we would say that there needs to be clarity about how the strategic plan is driving the organization allocation of staff. And the second bullet, these are tied together, is that the items of the strategic plan are part of the staff's annual evaluations. So that when we see the priorities that staff, this gentleman and these fine folks, are being evaluated in part on, are we seeing movement on these areas of priority? So I don't know if that's true for you all or not. This is an example of promising practice from another state. Each of these are examples of promising practice from another state that we think would be valuable and would speak to some of the issues that you all surfaced in the interviews. And so those two together are really kind of one. Is the organization's allocation of staff tied to the priorities, or the staff's annual evaluations tied to the priorities? Questions about that? All right. The full board has undergone extensive training on effective governance together and has a governance improvement plan. Probably shouldn't surprise you that we find that to be a promising practice. Certainly, boards that have gone that direction will probably tell you they found it more useful than not. And so that's something that, again, with each of these, we can connect you with state board members across the country for whom this is true, and you can visit with them, figure out how did this work out for you? Is this something that we'd like to do for ourselves? But you all, as part of your implementation timeline, saying, hey, we want to build into that some more extensive governance training to help us grow as a team. We can point you to boards that have done that, and they can tell you about the benefits they feel like that's had for them in terms of ironing out some of the issues that you all surfaced. Implementing a policy of statewide literacy academies. Have you all done this?
Not under that name. Tell us more about what you mean.
Where basically training was provided for teachers across the state on the science of reading.
Yes.
Okay, so then you were already engaged in promising practices. Hallelujah. Glad to hear that. Out of curiosity, how's that worked out for you?
It's in progress.
Okay, so it's too soon to be clear, but so far the implementation is rolling out. Gotcha. Excellent, excellent. Proactively collaborating to develop IBCs in high needs areas with folks in industry. And actually seeing that, with folks in industry, bringing teachers and folks in industry together to collaboratively develop industry-based certificates in high need areas. So I don't know if this is something you all are doing or not, but can certainly connect you with Stacy or Candace. They've really enjoyed, getting teachers involved in that process to really make sure that not only does it have the relevance from the industry, but then the curriculum design from the teachers. And then finally, implementing additional supports for local school boards. This is something that has recently been done in a few places where they said, as a state board, what we want to see is that local school boards have additional supports to be effective, that they have the types of training that's allowing them to be focused on student outcomes. And so if that is something that it all speaks to you, I can certainly point you to some of the states that are doing that as well, where again, where the state board has said, we're going to be more focused on student outcomes. What that looks like for us, we want local boards to have access to supports that make more focused on student outcomes and what that looks like for them. Any questions about that?
I'd like for you to talk about it a little more. I'm not sure what my questions are about it. So we develop policy. The local boards are obligated to develop local policy connected to those, and our engagement is mostly with the superintendents. So the state superintendent engages with the local superintendents, but there's not necessarily engagement with local boards, although there have been a number of resolutions since I've been on the board that they've used to communicate with us. We haven't really communicated with them outside of the policies that we've developed.
Yeah.
So there's they have a school boards association, and of course, their members come and represent them at our meetings, but I wouldn't say that it would be something that we're strategic about having partnerships or even this notion of modeling being effective governance structures or creating expectations for effective governance structure. It's always just been, well, it is what it is, right? As opposed to how can we all get better at serving students?
Yeah, so our recommendation is it generally is the same across the board. That the state board, the state superintendent, and the school board association collaborate on identifying what are additional supports that the state would be offering, that it's often useful to work with the state school board association to be the dissemination vector for those supports, and that you find some way of incentivizing it. This is through what I often refer to as carrots and carrot-flavored sticks. What are the things that might incentivize folks to adopt governance practices at the local level that are more aligned with improvement of student outcomes? So for example, if we had the conversation across all of your school boards, across local school boards across the state, about has the board adopted a set of goals around what students should only be able to do? Often that conversation goes a whole lot like the pre-launch conversation here went. And that people like looking around and looking, well, who's the one guy on the board who might have the answer to that, or superintendent tell us what they are. And our coaching to them would be the same thing as our coaching to you. That the job of the local school board is to represent the vision and values of their local community. And they should identify the priorities and then hand those to the superintendent and say, okay, we're delegating to you the authority to implement the vision and values of the community. And then as a local board, we will spend a lot of our time monitoring progress to ensure that the things that the vision and values of our community are actually happening in reality. And where they're not, to understand what the superintendent's pivot is, what the superintendent is doing differently to get closer to that. That is the same coaching that we'd offer you, is the same coaching we'd offer them. But if there is a partnership between the state board, the state superintendent, and the state school board association, then our experience is that is where you get the most bang for your buck. This is what it looks like to start getting everybody rowing in the same direction. but you all would have to figure out what incentives do we have access to help with them. So I'm thinking of one particular state. One of the things that they've done is they built in the board receiving training on and showing implementation of a more student outcomes focus into some of their grants. And so essentially, hey, if you want bonus points on your grant application with the state, you can have them. Show us that the governing body is getting super focused on student learning in that way. And essentially the policy thinking is, we would rather spend more of our discretionary dollars in places where we have evidence of greater local superintendent alignment than in places where we have less evidence of local superintendent alignment with student outcomes. And so things like that are, we connect you with state board members who are doing things like that, and state superintendents who are doing things like that to help incentivize the adoption of these types of behavioral practices.
So I think when I was originally getting connected to you, that the idea of also recognition, right? Because we talked about the carrot flavored stick, but I found the notion of recognition very compelling. And so we honor like our teachers of the year, our principals of the year, our superintendents of the year. But this notion of leader boards, like boards
Yes.
who are committed to being effective in their governance structure, who are identifying, naming their priorities, and who are coming back and evaluating their progress to success, while keeping the student focus is a really powerful notion. And so I appreciate you saying the idea of grants. I just wanted to also share that I found that recognition, which is not something that we're currently doing, to be compelling. And I'm interested in all the examples in this area. So if there's something that you can point me to.
We can connect you with all of those.
Okay, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, in terms of recognition, hugely agree. Local school boards kind of get dumped on an awful lot, and so they love any opportunity to actually be honored for the work they're doing, which just never happens. And so you saying, look, here are the behaviors that are going to help make sure that y'all are aligned with improvements in student outcomes. And here's the evidence that we'll rely on to see that you are growing in your use of these behaviors, and that when you reach a certain threshold, that we are going to build a press cycle for you by honoring you statewide. That is absolutely an incredibly valuable carrot to put out there. Like we're not just talking about it. We want to honor you when you do it, so that everybody can know, those are the folks right there who are making the sacrifices and improvements in student outcomes requires. Other reflections on that? All right. So those are your promising practices. And that means nothing left to do is try to wrap this thing up by talking about what are we going to do next. And the next steps, the big next step that we're recommending is the development of a implementation timeline that describes how the board should invest its time over the next 24 months. This should include, at a minimum, and we've got a few things that this should include, but we'll start with these ones. Minimum.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
What's significant about 24 months?
It's a long enough period of time that it gives you a realistic chance of causing the adult behavior changes to become calcified. So the problem is, when y'all put something into effect that, hey, this is how we're going to change, you all just don't meet enough. I'm not saying meet more. I'm just saying you don't meet often enough to really make those new habits automatic. And so it just takes a certain amount of time. So if you were meeting every single day, then I'd say, hey, you can knock this thing out in 30 days, but you don't. And so it's just our impression of how long does it take to make a significant shift in governance behavior for that to just become automatic for a governing body. And our experience is it usually takes somewhere from 18 to 24 months.
Given where we are in the cycle right now, it looks to me like a recommended transition plan
Yeah, so definitely the top of the list, for you all, you really need to add into this would be the transition part of it over the next 6 months. Well, I'd say over the next 9 months, is some potential transition planning. But I would not stop there. I would give the next board a gift of an implementation timeline that lasts over 24 months. I think what's problematic is when a board leaves and says to the next board, good luck figuring it out. Instead, give them a plan that says, here's what if we were going to have been here for 24 months, here's what we would have been doing. Y'all can make decisions about whatever you're gonna do. But then they actually have something to edit from, that has the thoughtfulness and has been embedded with the wisdom that all of you have. Particularly since so many of you won't be here after the next transition. To me, it makes it all the more essential that you communicate with them proactively. Here's what we think is reasonable, the wisest things for you all to be focused on. Again, after the transition, our coaching to them is look at this timeline and which parts of it work for you all, which parts don't, if we need to make, but let's make adjustments. Let's not just throw it all out. This at least the previous board gave y'all a gift of a starting point. Y'all just have to modify it to fit for y'all and then keep improving. That gives them a huge head start. And so yes, the transition plan part of it over the next 9 months is to be pretty heavily focused on y'all who are here in the room right now. But giving them the gift of having all of those additional out months lined up for them is a huge, huge benefit that we strongly encourage you to provide.
I do need to interrupt. Shan, it seems like we're moving to the last item on the agenda. Is there anything official you'd like for us to do in that regards, or do you want us to just keep going?
Keep going.
Okay, thanks.
So before I get into each of the individual items, because we've got 3 items on this page and a couple items on the next page. Questions about this idea. So we have one really good question. Why a 24-month implementation timeline for a board that won't be here in 24 months? It's an excellent question. Other questions about this recommendation that we have of a next step being developing a 24-month timeline. Other questions about that before we get into some of the specific items that we recommend be addressed on that timeline.
So 24 months really does seem like a long time, because it's half of a term. Have you done it where it's been 12 months?
So we've done it as little as 9 months. Particularly in your case, I just wouldn't recommend. Like if there was, a quarter or a third of the body kind of transitioning off, you've got enough of a sense of what are priorities left on the board that I think a 9 to 12 month implementation timeline makes sense. By the way, you meet quarterly?
No, we meet about every other month.
Every other month.
Yes.
Yeah, so we're talking about 12 meetings. Yeah, so essentially building out a timeline for the next 12 meetings is absolutely a recommendation. Obviously, this recommendation is like every other recommendation. It's y'all's plan, not ours. So if you say, hey, we only want 6 months and as soon as I'm off the board, I'm out, then so be it. We don't recommend that. We recommend that y'all be on the hook for the next 9 months, but that you lay out a path for future boards, that they have some idea of, okay, here's exactly what's coming at us, here are key things we've got to be worried about. And if they agree or disagree, that's on them. What it would look like to develop this is we take all the notes from today, and we've got a lot of notes from today, but then we also go back and interview each of you again to figure out, okay, so what, now that you've gone through this full conversation, what are things that you think that the state board needs to have on its focus over the next 24 months? We'd have that conversation with each of you, and then we'd use that to create a rough draft timeline. Then we would hand the timeline back to y'all, and then you would have to decide what to do with it. Do we adopt it? Do we modify it and then adopt it? Do we throw it out the window? That's a y'all thing. The creation of it, we would support you with. But then what to do with it, that's on y'all. If y'all decide that you want to adopt it or some version of it, then we'd be more than happy to stick around and support you with its implementation. If you decide not to adopt it, that's fine. Then we had a good time together today, and that's the end of the journey. But should be clear to say, if you would like us to support you going forward, you need to have some type of plan that we're working against. We can't just be willy-nilly. That's not how effectiveness happens. You have to have a clearly defined work plan. And our recommendation is that yours happens the last 24 months. Other questions about this idea of an implementation timeline for the board's continuous improvement? All right, then we'll just run through some of the bare minimum things that we think should be on it. Clarification of the board's top priorities, I think that's job number one. Just gotta get on the same page about that, everybody rowing in the same direction. The next time anybody comes and asks any of you that question, ideally all of you will have the exact same answer. Developing of a transition plan, we've already talked about that, we think that's important. Developing a board self-evaluation process and timeline, we already mentioned that and why we think it's important. Intentional time and facilitation, providing for generative conversations around current and future policy. We definitely heard this in a few different ways, that there's some policies that you all just don't feel like you've had enough spaciousness to have a conversation around, and that the conversation didn't actually feel like a conversation, it felt more like a bit of a tit for tat. That's not exactly how y'all said it, but that's kind of my interpretation of what y'all said, and that what might help is a form of facility, is to say, we're gonna have a non-decision-making discussion about this area. We're gonna do some brainstorming, there's no rights, there's no wrongs, we're not making any decisions, this is a non-decision-making, this is just a generative conversation, where we're just pulling for the best of each of us, to surface what's there. We're not gonna try to land anything, we're just gonna try to surface ideas, really kind of dig in, and then use that as the impetus for a current or future policy modifications. But that type of more open-ended generative conversation that is facilitated and that helps think through potential policy, that just sounded like something that you all might benefit from. If you feel like you...
How would you read that on a board agenda? Who would be the facilitator?
You all would have to decide who the facilitator is. Certainly, we could facilitate that, happy to do so. But you probably also have really skilled facilitators. It's helpful if they have domain-specific knowledge that generally benefits facilitation, so you understand the context. But if you have somebody who's just a rock star facilitator, here in this area, but even if they don't have a ton of domain-specific knowledge, then facilitating a conversation where you all are just surfacing ideas and aspirations and trying to dig in on one specific idea, that could work as well.
Right, I get the concept, I think it's a great concept, I'm just trying to envision how it plays out in reality.
Yeah.
And you actually see that as being an agenda item on a regular board meeting, or do you see that as being a separate meeting? Or,
So I don't know.
I don't know that we've ever had a third party come in here and facilitate a board meeting before, so I'm just trying to get a better feel for what experience you might have, something like that.
Yeah, so I think of it more as facilitating a conversation, which I think is much more akin to what's happening today, where clearly your board chair is not facilitating this conversation, clearly I am. It'd be much more akin to that only, but with the intention of pulling ideas. So one way it would look on the agenda is we're gonna have a generative conversation around fill in the blank problem we're having. So one of the problems that was brought up is teacher retention. That might be it. Or another problem that might be brought up is the relevancy of IBCs or whatever, but think of a problem, but don't show up with solutions. Show up that we're gonna have a generative conversation and surface everything we do here. If you look at the organizational development psychology work on this, one of the worst things that governing bodies do is they immediately anchor whenever a new issue comes up. So what happened, people like take this straw poll immediately at the beginning of the conversation. And then what do you spend the rest of the conversation doing after everybody's anchored in on their vote?
Trying to move on.
Yeah, Red Rover, will you come right over? And we're spending all our time trying to get people to come to our side, but we're not actually having a generative dialogue around it to actually surface what else is there. And so when you asked this question earlier around, how could we have more intentional consensus building? From our conversations with you all, that step has been missed. The generative dialogue around policy, was sidestepped. Instead, you went straight into, okay, we got in this corner and in this corner, and then let's, kind of debate it out. But it doesn't sound like that's actually resulted in finding a different space. It's worked out the way it has. And so that's where this recommendation comes from. Like I said, multiple of you expressed similar things that to us, this is a possibility. But even if you don't do this, the one piece of coaching I would offer is structure your policy conversations so that you do not anchor at the beginning of the policy conversation, so that you try to avoid, as an individual practitioner process, avoid anchoring before the conversation. Like, don't be on Facebook, hey y'all, here's what I'm about to go in here and get done. In that moment, you've anchored. Well, now if some really great perspective from a different part of the state shows up in the meeting, you've already anchored yourself, and psychologically, you were just less likely to really hear what's being said in a generative way because you've already pre-anchored it. So, as a personal practice and as a facilitation practice, even if you don't do this, avoid early anchoring. This doesn't lead to the type of strong consensus building that you were describing earlier. That you really need to come in with we're gonna talk about this particular problem. We're not gonna solve it today. We're not gonna make a decision today. We're just gonna dig into this and surface everything that's there with the understanding that we will make a decision, but that will be a subsequent conversation, not this conversation. That's what's meant by generative conversations. Is that clarify what is meant by this? Does that make sense for folks? Okay, so whether y'all think that's useful to you or not, that's a y'all call. But based on things that we've heard, this is something we want to put up for consideration. And then the last one we already mentioned, superintendent evaluation metrics and process. If it's not already, well, let me back up. It is not currently highly aligned to the board's priorities. Why? Because y'all are perfectly clear what that is, so it's not really a doable thing. But once you all have clarified your priorities, then you need to just make sure that not only your self-evaluation is aligned to it, but the superintendent's evaluation is as well. So those are the things at minimum that we would recommend show up in your implementation timeline. Questions about this idea of an implementation timeline or the items we discussed? So,
Thank you. So I really appreciate it. As you can imagine, for me personally, being on this board for almost 12 years, it'll be 12 years when I roll off in December, I care deeply and hear from my fellow board members that they want to see the success with the next board as well. So I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to us and then also being able to feed it back to us in a way that we can turn it into some action steps. So I thank you and I appreciate the time being here. Board members, do you have any reflections or closing comments that you'd like to make? I'm sure it's a conversation that will continue. And we can go ahead and adjourn. Thank you very much.
Thank you.